In this video, we're going to be talking about training categories, and there's 6 categories that we're going to be going over. Shaping, basics, fundamentals, upgrades, routines, and elite skills. When I came up with this idea of training categories, it was over an evolution of time, but once I nailed this down, this transformed the way I coach gymnastics, along with the other coaches that I work with coach gymnastics. This was the game changer right here. And so I'm really excited to present this to you and really help you understand this, because this changed how I communicate with my athletes, the type of energy I come with at certain events, understanding how to measure outcomes and what outcomes I'm pursuing. And it put the whole story of gymnastics together. This was one of the huge missing links, essentially. So shaping and basics, okay? Just up here at the top, kind of simple. Most of the people would have a visualization, an idea of what shaping and basics are. And then you have elite skills down here. There's kind of an order of priority going on. But what I want you to see is the contrast. I have the easiest stuff and I have the most difficult stuff. And what I noticed and just the backstory of why this is developed this way, what I noticed was when I would watch gyms train high-level athletes, I would notice that they allowed those athletes that were pursuing the highest level to kind of huck and chuck skills in safe environments, essentially. So they'd let that kid do double backflips into a foam pit. They'd spot that child on a front giant, or they'd spot those kids on standing back tucks on a beam or something. They're letting them do things that are a little bit more risky or high level, even when they're not ready for it. And so that was kind of like they're pushing the timeline, as I would term it. They're allowing the athlete to push the timeline, even though they might be competing as a level 3, 4, 5. They're pushing the timeline all the way out there as far as they can. And so what I realized is, like, there's this value of how well can I do something, the easy stuff. But there's also this value in how far can I push my timeline out there. Now, the difference between what I saw with gyms who are pushing high-level athletes and getting actually results from producing high-level athletes, the difference I saw from them and then what gyms were doing when they were following kind of the same methodology is, and I did this myself because I was in the learning and through the learning stages, is I would allow the athlete to push their timeline in an environment that was detrimental to them. And that might just be landing on hard surfaces. That might be doing something that fear is attached to, instead of pushing the timeline in areas that they have the most amount of confidence, or as I like to term it, max effort. And so that's going to turn into a conversation about capacity. And so capacity, what an athlete's ability to handle, that kind of dovetails into this story, but the training categories themselves is more about the nuts and bolts, the things that you're going to do. It doesn't tell you when or why or where you're going to do it necessarily, because a lot of that comes down to the athlete's capacity and comes down to your time management, your calendar, your training periodization, essentially. So diving into shaping. Okay, now there's some familiar words here, but I'm redefining them. So I just want you to have an open mind to why I'm redefining them the way I am. And I'm going to try to attach a little bit of concrete backstory to it so you can get on board and say, yeah, Raleigh, I'm tracking with what you're saying. Because some of the stuff I'm going to be talking about is going to be tweaking things that are just like, you're familiar with it, you might be super confident in it, but I'm just going to tweak it a little bit, and there's purpose in why I want to tweak it. And I'm not saying that what you know isn't worth anything. I'm not saying what you know it doesn't have value. I'm just saying if you could tweak what you know, you might start to see the picture come together a little bit better in the athlete's development. The first thing to understand is you're not going to get away from any of this stuff. It doesn't matter who you are or what you're doing inside your gym. You're going to have to, at some point, confront one of these categories at some point in time in your training. So it's inevitable. So we are all inevitably dealing with something that's in one of these categories at all times in all forms of our teaching. So you cannot avoid these concepts. The other thing to understand is a lot of this that you're going to be doing is directly correlated to how are you blending an athlete's ability, like how you compartmentalize an athlete's ability and then blending it all together. And what I mean by that is if you look at other art forms of learning, I'll take music for example. If you you take music and you start learning the scales, or you just learn how to just hit individual notes first and then you learn the scales. Learning the scales is not necessarily learning a song. So I need to learn a song, but you also need to learn scales. You can't just go, well, I only need to learn scales. I'm not going to learn anything about a song. I'm just going to only learn scales. You could do that, but most average level competitive people are not going to be holding interest on scales only. They're going to need a little bit of the carrot to be like, hey, let's learn a song. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. Mary had a little lamb. Let's learn that while you're learning scales. It's like you need to feel it out and kind of understand. So you have two compartmentalized ideas, but they're going to blend together because the better you get your scales, the better you're going to get at playing a song. And so as you compartmentalize, you get better in one area, eventually it's going to bleed over in all the rest. You get better in one area, eventually it's going to bleed over in all the rest. And so compartmentalizing these things, realizing that they're all going to blend together, and it's inevitable that they blend together. However, our brain, okay, really loves focusing on one category at a time. And I can't tell you, I've done some sort of scientific study to understand that. This is just literally, I understand from trial after trial that when I get an athlete and I say, this is the direction we're going, we're chasing upgrades, we're chasing elite skills, we're chasing basics, they're way easier to work with because they're focused on one area. But when I try to start mixing all these together in one moment, your results are just all over the place. The other thing is when you chase one, you can measure it. When you can measure something, then you can have a reason to come back to it and improve upon it because you already are measuring your improvements. And thus it takes the mystery out of gymnastics. So no more talking about the randomness. Here's the training categories. Shaping. Everyone's done shape work to some degree. My connection with shaping is understanding, this is the tweak I want to be making. Shaping needs to be, okay, vocabulary connected to, so you're connecting your vocabulary to a position. That's it. Now, is there a million different things you could do with shaping? Yes, we can go into that, but this whole training is an idea of layering on top of what you're already doing. So if you like doing hollow holds a certain way, fine, do them a certain way. If you like doing finishing handstands in a certain position, fine, finish them in a certain position. The point is your vocabulary needs to be connected directly to a position, and it needs to be simplified. So part of getting the brain attached, and this goes into the mental side of sports psychology and learning from the sports psychologists that are out there in our community, a lot of them will talk about using a word, like what word are you focusing on? And narrowing all the athlete's actions down to a word. And so if we're trying to get the mental state to connect to a word, like light, or tight, or fast, or up, and we want to get, or lift, or whatever it is, push, we want that word because the brain needs one word to focus on at a time, and then you sequence the words, and then you get a rhythm, and you go, okay, it's push, kick, lift, you know, and then you have this series of words. Well, positions need to be connected to that. Push, kick, lift. What does push look like? What does kick look like? What does lift look like? That's what needs to be happening. And so in shaping time, it's not just here, do all these positions, let me fix you, and that's it. It should be, here's a word attached to this position. So then when I say that word every single time in practice, you know exactly what position I'm going for. I think a clear example would be like the hollow position or the dish shape position, okay? Because the hollow position kind of has a spectrum attached to it. You know, like there's a straight hollow and then there's like an extreme hollow. If you're doing the men's tap over the bar, you know, you're like setting up that really pikey hollow over the top of the bar. It's like, yeah, there's this position, but then it's like, but then there's like the, I need you to be straight type of hollow, just more hollow in your chest, but open hips type of hollow happening maybe when you're doing tumbling or something like that. So there's variations. So just using one word hollow to have multiple different positions, it's not effective. So it'd be easier to say like, I need a tap hollow, or I need a support hollow, or I need a flip hollow or something, and that's just making stuff up off the top of my head, or just come up with totally different names, right? So you could have just degrees of how much you want that shape bend to happen, and you could just be like, and associate it to shapes, you know, like we're doing rainbow shape compared to arch shape compared to dish shape, and then they just have different words attached to them. But that's what shaping, in my opinion, should be. Because once the brain has a word to connect to a position, the rest of the conversation is so easy. It's so easy to now not have to repeat yourself over and over again and convince somebody that what you're saying is right, but their interpretation of it is wrong, and you're spending more time ironing that out than saying, this is the word, this is the position. Show me the position, I use the word. So then you go in through your shaping, you just go, show me this position, show me this position, show me this, and they go, do, 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 and they go through all the positions, boom, we know the brain's attached. But you can go right through your shaping exercises, get everyone's brain set up and go, okay, I'm going to use this word, see what it looks like, and go, oh, that person doesn't understand this word well enough. Let me go fix it. That's what this word means. Okay, let's go back to it. And inside of shaping, you're going to have training components, essentially like how fast can you get into it, how long can you hold it for. There's going to be other, can you sequence shapes together, or basically word phrases together. But that's what I'm thinking about when I think of shaping. Okay, so shaping. Then it builds into, so now we've got positions, isolated positions essentially. And you could transition through, but really it's the isolated position that you should be focused on. So you're transitioning to a position essentially, and then figuring that out. Basics. This is what I'm looking at like a cornerstone skill. And so I'm going to call it a cornerstone skill because they're not fundamentals. They're not fundamentals. And so there's a difference. What I see with basics versus fundamentals is basics needs to be the most basic level of a skill on an apparatus or event that is required to reach a competitive level. And what I mean by this is this difference between bars and, let's just say, floor tumbling. When you go to bars, and you're teaching bars on a competitive level, the early stage levels don't really actually do skills that are applicable to the upper levels at all. It's like you're going to do a stride circle. It's not directly connected. You might find elements in there that you could be like, well, it has wrist shift in there. It's like, but a stride circle, nobody's really stride circling. Okay, a glide, nobody's really just elementing a glide. It's like that's not really what's connecting to. There's way more. The glide needs a kip attached to it. So just the glide isolated by itself is a component. It's a piece, but it's not a cornerstone skill essentially. You have, what else do you have? Leg cuts when we were doing the stride circles in those routines, and there's other things. You know, a cast off push away maybe is for a dismount or an undershoot dismount. They're not necessarily cornerstone skills. They're elements, they're drills, they're pieces and components that help build into skills, but they're not cornerstone skills. And so what I noticed was, and this is where me and my head coach on my competitive team were talking, and I'm just like, why is it that bars is so much harder to get ahead? It takes so much longer to become proficient on bars than it does all the other events. Now, I've heard all the other reasons. I've heard all the reasons like, you know, in women's gymnastics, 3 events are using your legs and 1 event is using your arms. Okay, that's fine. And so now we have more repetition going on our legs, and we have more repetition with tumbling because 3 events are more tumbling related and 1 event is more swinging and circling related. So there's a coordination element, but it still wasn't jiving with me that it would take so long for someone to become proficient at bars if they got the strength and they got the coordination. And so I wanted to know, well, what's the problem? Then I realized at the base layer of gymnastics in the competitive level, okay, at what I would consider if we were to do like the, let's just think back handspring, introductory level gymnastics, let's just say back handspring is basically the base level. Well, we could say there is a round off, but basically you do a back handspring on floor for tumbling, and it's like that's the beginning level of real gymnastics, essentially. Well, that back handspring is used in every single level afterwards. Now, I'm not saying you have to back handspring, but I am saying that once you learn to back handspring or front handspring, the back handspring is a back whip, is a back layout with just a change of direction. The actual movement, the energy that you need, it's all directly connected. Or the front handspring is a front whip or a front layout essentially with the energy and the shapes. It's just changing the direction. But a stride circle is not a clear hip handstand. Now you could say a back hip circle is a clear hip handstand because a back hip circle goes to a clear hip which goes to a clear hip handstand. So there's a direct pathway to that skill. But how many kids are in the base level doing toe circles essentially? Because you're like, well, a toe circle is going to turn into a toe shoot handstand. It's like most people aren't starting with toe circles. So they're not doing toe circles. They might be doing back hip circles, but they're not doing back hip circles to get to clear hips. They're just back hip circling. They're not really necessarily thinking about where does it need to go. And so it's like bars needs to have cornerstone skills. Well, every event has cornerstone skills, and they're the base layer of skills that you're going to need. The example right now, and this is your interpretation. You could decide what those cornerstone skills are, but the point is that they're skills that you're going to see that transcend through all the levels. They're not just isolated to one level. They're skills that transcend all the levels. So take beam, for example. While beam is not going to necessarily have a front walkover or a back walkover at all levels, the motion and the flexibility, the coordination of doing a front walkover and back walkover is directly connected to handsprings and layout step outs. And so there's an importance of going, well, just, okay, back walkovers is a cornerstone because I can see it directly connected all the way through all the levels. I was talking to my head coach again, I'm like, well, what is another one? We're thinking, okay, well, a handstand on beam. And I'm like, I don't really see a lot of skills in upper levels just pass through a straight position. Like, it's a handstand. I don't really see that directly connect. So then we had to think about how we wanted to change it. We wanted to kick up into the handstand as hard as we possibly could. So we took a handstand. We knew that it was important, but I didn't know how to connect it directly through all the levels. So again, this is how we solved our cornerstone problem using basics. We said, okay, well then the handstand needs to kick up as hard as it possibly can, because there's other skills that require the same exact kick through all the levels. Kick up as hard as I possibly can, but the handstand is going to stop. It's going to have this tension, which is not a bad thing, because now I have to think about how tight can I hit something. That's good. That concept goes through all the levels, fine, but I really want to split. So now I'm going to kick up, hit that handstand, stop, and then bow, drop into a split. Now that split handstand position, that does go through all the different levels. Okay, so that's good. And then I lever out. Lever out goes through all the different levels. So we put a sequence together. It's not as pretty in conversation as just saying like a kip cast handstand is a basic, because it goes through all the levels essentially. But it's a way of us fudging and getting that handstand shape, but we had more purpose now than just saying, let's hit handstands. There's more purpose behind it. A full turn, not a half turn, not a 1.5 turns, like a full turn. Because you can get through all the levels with just a full turn. So that's a basic. So that's where basics are, cornerstone skills that transcend all the levels. They're not pigeonholed into a level. Fundamentals. So the difference between basics and fundamentals, then they're kind of similar in words, but I didn't have a better word to come up with these skills. It's broken up into two categories, essentially. Okay, so I have dynamics, and I tried to keep it with gymnastics language on how you're judged, essentially. Okay, and amplitude. So going into, we have basics, cornerstone skills. Fundamentals, we have two categories of fundamentals, dynamics and amplitude. And they're very, very connected to each other. But what I found was when I was coaching both of them smashed together, I was giving jumbled feedback essentially back to my athletes. I'd be like, okay, focus on that, and then I'd be like, focus on that. And so basically what I'm saying is, I would be like, okay, do a tumbling pass. Oh, your dynamics are bad. Oh, do a tumbling pass. Oh, your amplitude is bad now. Okay, go back. Oh, your dynamics is bad. Oh, your dynamic. Okay, now get your amplitude. Okay, now, oh, your amplitude again. And they're ping-ponging, the athlete is ping-ponging between trying to figure out how to hit my result. And again, if the athlete's trying to hit my result and my result keeps ping-ponging back and forth, there's no consistency. So I had to separate it. I had to say, we're going to have training time that's just dynamics, and we're going to have training time that's just amplitude. And while I know they're directly connected to each other, it allows us to focus on what are we trying to measure right now and understand. And so prime example of this would be tumble track. We go to tumble track, we want multiple whips down the tumble track. That's dynamics over and over again. Ding, 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 ding. It's rhythm, it's tempo, it's the ability to move dynamically, but also in sequence, just over and over and over again. And so when I think of dynamics, I think repetition, okay, with max energy, like max effort. So you're looking for repetition at max effort essentially. And then amplitude is like, how do I take this energy and how do I convert it into distance essentially? I know there's internal amplitude, this is more external amplitude, which will be affected by internal. The dynamics also generally deals with either it's a linear direction, and so usually you're dealing with a horizontal direction, and amplitude is generally dealing with a vertical direction. And so multiple layouts down the tumble track, dynamics, and then I'm going to do a layout at the end. I'm going to see how high I can send it up. And so now I have 3 whips to a layout. And then I can decide in that series, I can say we're just focusing on dynamics. What I'm going to determine, how I'm going to determine if our dynamics is good is how well that layout moved, essentially. Where did it go? How well did it move? And so if the whips are like up and down and low and all over the place, that layout's going to go uncontrollably someplace and it's not predictable. But if that layout is predictable every single time because my whips are predictable every single time, I can say, oh, your dynamics are good because our layout is happening. But I'm not measuring how high the layout is. I'm just measuring the consistency of the layout, essentially. But then when I go to amplitude, it's kind of like, all right, I don't really care if your whips down the tumble track are perfect. I don't care if they're perfectly in a straight line. Maybe there's some deviation going on. As long as the last one hits the surface as hard as possible and that layout flies as high as you possibly can go. That's all I care about, is does the last one convert all the energy to a distance, to an up position. And so that's what's happening. So fundamentals is taking more concepts. And if you think about skills, there's only so many skills that you can apply dynamics amplitude to. However, everything comes out of this, okay? Because you need aggressive, dynamic tumbling on floor in order to get the amplitude that you're going to want. You're going to need aggressive, dynamic circling on bars in order to get the amplitude that you're going to want. And so it's like when we talk, when you think of like shapashes or any sort of release from a clear hip or a toe hand, it's like, is there any lift on that bar happening? If you can't clear hip handstand or toe hand and get pull up on the bar happening, then you're not getting enough lift that's going to be launching you off that bar to either grab the high bar or do a release and catch the same bar. So understanding the importance of dynamics was like, now we go into clear hip work and we go, you know, if clear hip handstand was a cornerstone skill, we would just be looking for perfection. We'd just be going, oh, is it perfect? But because it's a dynamic skill, we're looking for how much energy is in it, and then how are you maintaining, conserving that energy essentially? Can you keep that energy going with you? It changes what we're measuring. So dynamics, amplitude. Upgrades, this is level specific, okay? So this is level specific. Now, and inside of level specific, it's category driven. Okay, so it's skill category driven. Skill category driven. Okay, level specific, skill category driven. So what this means is we go to our whatever, we're in our week training plan. We're on a Thursday, let's say. We go over to floor and it's for upgrades. Well, I know on floor you're going to throw the skills that are at your level that you're competing. So and the way I have this set up right now is I have it on a rotation cycle, but you might have enough time if you do 20 hours a week or more, or however you want to structure it. But what I have is basically I have tumble, dance, tumble, dance. So one day their upgrades are all tumble driven, the next day their upgrades are dance driven, then it's tumble driven, then it's dance driven. So we're alternating categories. But I know that once I get to the tumble, it's like this is what skills you're going to work on, and then we're going to progress through that line. And because I have 2 tumble days, one will be back, one will be front. So then I know, okay, we're going through back tumbling, and I know that, okay, let's just say we start at a back layout. You hit a back layout. You pass the assignment at back layout where we're going to progress as far as we can because we're trying to upgrade that back layout. Now, upgrades happen on your competitive surface preferably. So they happen on the surface you're trying to compete because they're directly connected to the level you're competing. And the question is, can I upgrade that skill? You run into this problem in a lot of training, and this is where this kind of solves. So a little backstory on upgrades. If I'm just training skills and I'm going, let's say I'm training a back layout half, and you're on a trampoline doing back layout halves, a tumble track doing back layout halves, you're going floor into the foam pit, back layout halves. At what point do you know when to put it on a hard surface? And then how do you adjust your time between getting routines in and doing upgrades, or getting floor time in and doing upgrades? Everybody has a solution. You have a solution. I've seen how the solutions work. However, it requires some level of time management, and you have to keep track of it because not everybody is ready to throw the next skill on the competitive surface at the same time. And so you have one athlete 1 week who's like ready to go, then you have to make a modification for them. And then you have another athlete and a few weeks later that's ready to go, you have to make a modification for them. And so it's more individualized, and individualization creates sometimes time management problems. And so by applying upgrades as a category, All we do is say, okay, this is the time that we work on our competitive surface, and we're working on the skill that we're going to be competing, and if you hit the assignment, you can upgrade it to the next thing. Now, if they're not ready to upgrade to the next thing, okay, so then they just keep working on the same thing, trying to make it even more perfect or even more better. But because we have all these categories, we've never run into that problem. We've always run into the problem of now a person is ready because they've already done the dynamics and the amplitude. They've already put in all these pieces together. So they show up at upgrades, they do their back layout, and it's like, cool, it's time for you to put a back layout half on the floor. And they're like, all right, cool. We get an 8-inch route or a landing surface that makes it easy for them to at least land safely. And if they have an error or a mess up, they're going to be fine. So we're going to adjust the impact loads, but we're putting it on the competitive surface. And then that lets us know if a person's ready and where is their brain at. Because if a person shows up, an athlete shows up to bars, let's say, and they're working on clear hip, and they're at clear hip horizontal in upgrade land, let's just say, and they need to get to clear hip 45, and you say, okay, your clear hip horizontal passed, you're good, you got to take it to 45. They're like, oh, I don't know if I can. You know that they're not being prepared. They're not being prepared enough in their clear hips over here in dynamic land. You know that they're not getting their shapes dialed in. You know that their basics are behind. And so if somebody's not willing to upgrade, there's resistance in that upgrade. I'm not going to take it to handstand because I'm scared. Then upgrades exposes where the problem is in the other stuff. And so by being super focused there, it allows us to see where athletes' fears come in or where the discrepancies in their strengths and weaknesses appear. And so that's why narrowing in and allowing upgrades to exist really solves a lot of problems. Now, upgrades, they progress through skill categories. So if I'm doing back tumbling, then I progress my back tumbling. I don't switch skill categories until I've progressed as far as I can. If I go to back layout and I can't get to back layout half, okay, then switch categories. Now go to front tumbling. But the goal of upgrades is to progress the skill category as far as it will go, not just do variety. That's one key component there. Basics, and I want contrast here, basics is all about narrowing in on a skill and making it perfect. You're not trying to progress the skill. So you're doing a cast to handstand and you're on bars and you're trying to make that cast to handstand dialed in perfect. All the shapes, all the bounce of the bar, everything dialed in. And they're just going to repeat it, repeat it, repeat it, repeat it. There's no progressing. So we're basically working on the infinity of quality. It's like you can never get it perfect. We're just going to keep trying to make it better and better and better. And so the skill itself just stays isolated. Upgrades is working on the infinite, like the infinity of progression. Like, okay, you got this skill, go to the next skill. And it just infinitely continues progressing. So basics and upgrades are playing against each other because they're helping each other. One's focusing on going smaller and smaller, and one's focusing on the macro going further and further, essentially making your skill set bigger and bigger. And so that's how they complement each other. Routines. Routines pretty straightforward. It's just time to do routines. Now, how you want to do your routines, number sets, how you want to break them up is up to you. But this goes more into the capacity side of the assignments that you want to build routines in. But you may have heard of people, they do things like half routines, or they do things like full routines, and you have this deciding, are we doing first halves or second halves, or are we doing full routines? But there's more that we can get into that. But routines is just do your routines, however you want to do it. And how we measure routines, and we're going to talk about how we want to measure all of this in a different video. But how you measure all of this is going to kind of drive the assignment. And so we'll get further into the type of assignments that come along with this. I'm just explaining this. But routines, everyone should understand. You're linking all the skills, you're taking all this knowledge, and you're smashing it all together, and you're seeing how well somebody can execute everything that they've learned. And so that's really what routines is doing, is just putting all the pieces together. And there needs to be time for this. We do routines all year round. We just modify it, but we have one day a week that we're always doing routines. And then for us, we're doing a kind of a cyclical training plan. And so it's a little bit different than the long-term periodization, but that's just a difference in philosophy. So what we do is we have our first day is always routine day on certain events. And then on the third week of the month, the entire week is routine driven. And so then we have a competition routine week. And then the next week after that is our rest and recovery week. And then we do these cycles. And so then when we go to competition season, it's never a surprise to get ready for the routines, because we've always been getting ready for them. And in routine time, any upgrade that an athlete is learning, then they're able to insert that skill into their routine. So now there's motivation to do routines because they're inserting their upgrades into the routine when they're ready. So they're naturally progressing their routine over time, and they're maintaining their endurance essentially. So that's where we're doing routines year round. Okay, elite skills. This is pushing your physical limit as far as possible on the safest surface possible. So for us, it's a foam pit, and we're going to do the hardest thing you can possibly do into a foam pit as safe as you can possibly do it. The thing about elite skills is you have to understand that there's a huge risk of injury and breakdown because you're pushing a person to their limit. So you cannot approach pushing the person to their limit just kind of lackadaisical, willy-nilly. You can do it, just huck and chuck it, don't think about it. You can't do that, okay? You have to be highly responsible in your pushing somebody's timeline because there's a lot of bad that can happen. And so this takes a high level of attention and care through this process. And so never are we pushing somebody further than their physical limit or their mental limit. We're not pushing them beyond it because that's where someone's going to break. What we're doing is exposing somebody's potential. And so elite skills is exposing the potential. Okay, an athlete has the ability to do a double backflip off the tumble track. Their rotation is great. They got consistency in their back handsprings. They show confidence in everything that they're doing, but they just haven't done it yet. Elite skills is the place where we say, pull the trigger, do the double backflip. So elite skills is kind of the fun place where we're going to push the limits, but we've already prepared everything because we're doing all this other stuff. It's not just this mindless, hey, try this new thing again. It's doing the thing that all this is culminating for and saying, hey, you're ready for this next hard thing. Do that double backflip off the bar. You're ready for it. Your giants, your dynamics, your release points, your tap swings, all of it's making sense. We need a double backflip off the bar. Elite skills do not directly correlate to routines. So my athlete's at level 6, but she's doing double backflips off the bar. She doesn't need a double backflip off the bar for level 6 or even level 7, and really doesn't need it for level 8, but that'd be a really good thing to have. And so elite skills is pushing the timeline within reason. Now, the best, and this goes into capacity, but the easiest way to decide whether a person is ready for the elite skill or the pushing the timeline skill is, and this comes down to how we want to measure it, so you're going to see this pop up again, is max effort. Okay? Now, this is all I use to determine if somebody's ready for the elite skill. And all I do is say, can they basically do the dynamics and the timers, the amplitude? Can they get the dynamics, timer, amplitude with max effort? Can they do the basic level of the elite skill, whatever it is that you have, at max effort? Or do they look like they're lost, or that they have to have, slow things down so they can think more, or they don't know where they are? When you do something at max effort, you're pushing your nervous system to a limit where it's going to lose awareness of its surroundings. And so when you ask somebody to run as fast as they possibly can and then tumble, it's like things move so much faster than what their brain was used to, things start to go bad. And so what you do is you develop this layer, okay? You develop the dynamics and amplitude at max effort. And then what you start to see is you start to see it correlate, because if this is developed at max effort, then that max effort now can get attached over here to the elite skill, and now they'll run as fast as they can, they'll hurdle as fast as they can, they'll kick their leg as hard as they can, they'll turn over their tumbling as fast as they can, to a point where they, in previous experiments and trials and errors, essentially, an athlete wouldn't have been able to, they'd held back. But now, because they have this ability and confidence in it, and it's predictable, they'll apply it over here, and now you can push the limit. So if you're not really chasing the max effort in this category, then you're going to struggle in this category, because you're going to see it's not going to work out because they're still lacking. Because elite skills requires the max amount of effort out of the individual to perform the skill. And so that's the direct correlation is you can throw a double layout on floor. We've seen it. We've seen athletes throw double layouts on floor with bent legs, with poor shapes, but they still can do it. And what's the reason why they can do it? Because they can generate the amount of effort that they need, or the momentum, or the energy that they need, whatever words you want to use. And so elite skills is not about getting the quality of perfection. It's just about getting the energy and moving that energy and rotating around that energy at the highest level of potential, essentially. And so here's our 6 categories, training categories. You got shaping, basics, fundamentals, upgrades, routines, elite skills. We're going to talk a little bit later on how to measure and decide how you want to measure if an athlete is on track with them. And then we're going to discuss more about how the assignments work, on how would you build assignments into these 6 categories. But there you have it, training categories.